Ready to go? Okay, well, I'd like to call the meeting to order and roll call. George?
Here.
Mike?
Here.
Ron here, Joe?
Here.
And Doreen?
Here.
Hi, Doreen, how you doing?
Good, thanks. Sorry I can't be there in person.
Well, hey, this is the next best thing, and we'll make advantage of technology where we can. You can hear us.
Yep, and I look better this way.
You're kind of like that polar bear lost in a snowstorm.
Absolutely.
Okay. Has everybody had a chance to go over the meeting minutes from January 20th?
Yes. Yes.
And does everything make sense as far as the January 20th meeting, all 2.5 hours of it to you, Doreen?
The only thing that didn't make sense is why it took so long.
Oh, well, there's that.
But the verbiage itself is fine.
It's fine. It's fine. Okay. Meeting minutes myself. And then we have Jim Jacks with us tonight. Do we have any public comments? No public, any public comments on it? Anything that's not on this agenda that we know of, Jim?
Not that I know of, but I believe this gentleman is here to listen to the fence
Just
discussion.
kind of listen to the fence discussion and kind of go, what did I get myself into? Okay,
Did you sign in?
thank you. And then tonight, what I'll try to do is somebody needs us who wants to speak, I'll try to call on you to kind of keep a little order to things. Appreciate your cooperation and bear with me in case I do miss you or delay. Okay, let's jump in tonight's work session.
Don't you
Yes.
need to do, don't we need to approve the minutes?
You're correct. So, do I have a motion to approve the meeting minutes from January 20th?
I would like to make a motion that we approve the meeting minutes of January 20th.
Do we have a second? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, all votes aye for approval. Okay, now we'll launch into part 2 of our fence standards for a side yard adjacent to a street.
I thought we were gonna start with the housing thing first.
No.
No, over here, Lynn.
Over here, it's changed. If you looked at it, oh, you didn't? Okay.
Basically, all we're doing is working on the fence.
We're gonna go on the fence tonight and we're going to move the ADUs till our March meeting. We were here, Doreen, you've read the meeting minutes. So
Yes.
you have an idea of where we're at.
Yes.
The nutshell is we want to visit this. We made a motion last week to move forward with it as far as changing a height standard. Got a 2-2 tie vote, so it wasn't approved. I felt this is, to me and to us, a serious enough issue that we felt it worthwhile to continue the discussion tonight. And Jim, you prepared basically a summary but briefer staff report with regard to the fence standards. And as I understand it, from this, we're still going to look whether we want to make a motion to make a change or not. And if we do, it will probably be best for us to have a little bit of discussion, because as I'm thinking about this off and on during the course of this last week, a thought, an epiphany came to me. And, if we look at the code as it's currently written, it says that with the exception of any non-obscuring 4-foot tall fencing, including but not limited to chain link, wrought iron. So fencing that's open up to 4 feet, you're fine. It says fences hedges shall not exceed a height of 3.5 feet if they're within 10 feet of any property line adjacent to a street. We focused last meeting so much on the side yard and whether we should allow a side yard that we forgot that little piece of fence that for some properties, if they got a side yard next to a street, they've got a rear property line next to a street as well. And based on this, that little 10-foot section of that rear fence would also have to comply with that 3.5-foot height. Do you concur with that interpretation, Jim?
Well,
I think that's how.
Other than the exceptions, fences, hedges, and walls shall not exceed a height of 3.5 feet within 10 feet of any property line adjacent to a street.
It doesn't say what type of property line, it just says.
Only, yeah, there's a property line adjacent to a street. So I would agree with what you were just saying, that we're looking at the side yard and then there's an intersecting rear yard, and where that rear yard fence comes within 10 feet, then the two would need to, the two would fall under this requirement, the current requirement.
And I wanted to bring that up tonight because we get so focused on the side yard, we kind of forgot that little chunk. Yes, Joe?
Well, so I'm just looking at this, not the actual road. Is this section 2 fence standard side yard adjacent to a
Correct.
street
It's that
in
point, it's that point 3 that you're looking at. That is,
under
yeah, this
that.
is just a little snippet or section.
Okay.
That's the language that's currently in our
So
development.
it's sitting inside the side yard adjacent to a street section.
Yes, and it's any, right, and
If it comes within 10 feet of any.
street.
Well, any-
But this said side yard adjacent to a street,
That's a side yard adjacent to a street.
not a backyard.
Correct, side yard. So we got side yard, but even though you're in the side yard, it says any property line that is adjacent to that street. So that would, even though that would include that rear section of a fence that's also, call it the rear side. It's not just the side fence alone. And that's why I wanted to bring that point up, because that could change things.
I think we were talking about it. I asked it several times if the fence perpendicular had to be shorter back 10 feet too, and Jack's told me at that time that it was.
Correct.
So we did bring it up.
Okay, so it was brought up because of all of the
We just didn't,
discussion.
because we were working on that one property. That's
Right.
where I kind of side off.
It got cited, and, right,
And it
and,
was brought up.
okay. Then,
And it included any perpendicular fences that approach the property line too.
okay,
Not just parallel fences, but also perpendicular.
right. And so that, like I said, that probably got overshadowed because of all of the other
We were,
stuff.
we were focused on that particular issue.
Right.
So that-
And so, yeah, and then the other point of clarification is that as much as we wrangled with a focused issue, what we have to accomplish with this is not something that's necessarily specific to that property. It would apply to that property, but it needs to be something that applies to all of Lafayette. It is good for all of
You
Lafayette.
also had her hand raised.
Yes, Joe.
Oh, no, that was,
Oh,
no, I-
okay,
yeah.
you're just,
I'll raise my hand. then.
yes, yes, George.
I don't know how long all of you have been on the commission, seeing I'm fairly new, but
I know.
when I was just asking Mr. Jacks about the stone fence that's on Abbey Road in the new section. Why is that allowed? We were making such a strong issue with this one guy on his corner lot doing the same thing. Because that's definitely taller than 3 feet. If you go out the
The new development out there.
and they got a stone fence that's definitely over 3 foot tall.
And that stone fence, is that stone fence
It's the whole.
it's the whole fence that's the buffer to the highway?
Yes,
It's the rear yard of those lots.
and it's within the 10 feet rule.
But this is talking about a yard adjacent to a street.
Well, that would be a lot line that's adjacent to street. It would be the rear yard, but there's setback requirements. And once you're outside, then they would have to had to apply for a permit to build that fence as part of that subdivision. And the city would have to have reviewed those designs.
My question was, why was that approved?
That is something
I wasn't here when this.
right.
when
And that is something that we wouldn't have.
I'm just asking.
That we might do is, rather than focus on all the possible problems out
Yeah,
there,
we need to
we
focus on.
need to be able to end tonight's meeting and have a decision as to what to do with this
Yes.
language. And what Ron was just mentioning is, the current language is within 10 feet of any property line adjacent to a street. And so one way to take care of the rear fence issue is within 10 feet of a side property line adjacent to a street. And then that would open up, well, what about the front property line adjacent to a street?
Exactly.
So what we need to do is determine, and the whole issue that brought this to the planning commission's agenda is a fence that was in a side yard adjacent to a street. So
So
let's focus on that, get a resolution to that, and then we will move on. And it appears that the code may need to have more than just this number 3. It may need to just be broken into what can be in a front yard.
what can be in a side yard, what can be in a,
Side
yes.
yard, what can be in a side yard adjacent to a street, and what can be in a rear yard.
Right.
That would split it out, have simple, straight, understandable standards for each of those. And then we wouldn't have to deal with this one unnecessarily long sentence.
So on that thought, I had an idea. And again, I wrote it down. So if all of you will bear with me for just a moment, let me take and try to paint a picture through words of what I've got in mind for what might be. Jim is right. We got side yards, we got rear yards, we got front yards, and we can have side yards adjacent to a street and rear yards adjacent to a street. Yeah. So the question then becomes, could we perhaps create one standard that you wouldn't need to designate whether it is a side yard, front yard, rear yard, but it would be applicable to all 3 of those, and in such a way that a person can build, they have clear direction as how they would be able to build that fence. So my thought was this. When it comes, and remember, we're talking, we've got this 10-foot buffer. You got the property line that goes around the block, right? And so some houses are side yards, some houses are front yards. There's always a chance it could be a rear yard for somebody. That's a possibility. So in that 10-foot buffer zone, we could allow a fence to be built based on, shall we say, one of 2 criteria. That fence could be no more than 3.5 feet high if made of sight obscuring materials. So your regular fence or picket fence or whatever, which would be basically this similar to what we have today. That 3.5 foot standard. But let's make the adjustment again within that 10-foot zone. You may go up to a height of 6 feet, so long as the section that is above the 3.5 foot height line, so the upper section of that 6-foot fence above 3.5 feet, is made up of non-obscuring material. It could be something, and the examples like in our code, it could be a chain link, it could be wrought iron, it could be wire mesh, it could be something else, but the idea is that area is now there so that if you want to provide separation from yard and outside world for, in the case of the applicant, animals was one consideration. You could do that. At the same time, you keep it visually open. So now you don't run into any vision obstruction issues that could occur. That way you now have, and you can even go so far as to say that within that non-obstructing material, you could even say that it's something like 90% open, and that could be easily calculated based upon the size of the wires or whatever that's in there compared to the total area. And that, that would allow the fence to satisfy all requirements of both being open and visually open. Doesn't matter whether you build the front yard, you build the rear yard. Now, if you're in a rear yard inside that 10-foot buffer, you can do what you want, just like you do now, but within that, addresses the issues within that 10-foot zone. Yes, George.
Okay, are you talking about getting rid of the 2.5 foot requirement too, you're thinking?
No, we did. No,
No,
I said it could be up to 6 foot, but 3.5 feet is obscuring the rest.
No, there's a different fence for corner lots.
There's a different fence on a corner lot. And that brings up a good point. Thank you. That 2.5 foot that he's referring to is that tied into the clear vision? Or is that something else?
The clear vision has its own height limit. What was it, 3.5 feet
No, it was 2.5.
or 2.5 feet, 30 inches, I guess?
30 inches.
Yeah, because I know the issue, because that was a question, as far as,
On a corner lot, only on a corner lot, right at the corner. Then you have, what was it, 20 feet, 20
Yeah.
foot blades on each property line. You connect those with a line, and in that triangle, the maximum height is 30 inches.
So
That would be in a front yard situation.
So wouldn't it be simpler to make the shorter fence?
that would be the perfect example of where, let me phrase it this way. I would want to verify that the engineering standard for clear vision is 30 inches.
Well,
Because,
It's in the code.
okay, so if it's 30 inches, then I would say going with 30 inches as opposed to 3.5 feet all the way around would be a better choice.
it just simplifies. the
Yes, the idea is to make it simpler. So you could have 2.5 feet of solid wood fencing, and then your other 3.5 feet that gets you to that 6 foot mark would be
Well,
visually open.
I can see where that would jump up the cost of the fence. It would be easier just to make a chain link.
Well, that's
If
possible.
we can, I appreciate that is like a universal standard that would presumably fit anywhere. But we don't need to solve anywhere. The fence standard for the front yard is simple and clear. And the language here, like I was mentioning, needs to, I think, be split so that there's a statement for front yards, statement for rear yards, a statement for interior side, and a statement for side yards adjacent to a street. And so if we can focus on the side yard adjacent to the street, and if what the proposal was is within 10 feet, if it's site obscuring, then it would be limited to 3.5.
If it was cited, if you
But
read one,
the people who were requesting the variance, they weren't interested in half of their fence that would be site obscuring being whatever, 3.5 feet high. And then the rest of the fence being open because they wanted privacy.
correct.
They wanted a fence on the property line, 6 feet high. You can't see through it.
Right, that's what they desired.
Right.
But what I'm getting at is because of, we look at it, we go to, again, this is a side yard that is adjacent to a street. So we've got a 10-foot buffer zone right now. The question becomes, do we want to relieve that buffer zone? And I would say No, only because depending upon how and where that fence sets, if that rear section that's in the side yard of the fence is also 6 feet, and there is a driveway right behind, okay, this has to be something that's kind of, it may not need to be universal, but it needs to be applicable and workable for all of Lafayette, not just the applicant.
Why wouldn't it be? Why wouldn't it be good for all of Lafayette and not just that one?
Corner lots have, they got two.
Corner lot, yeah, corner lots are a little unique.
Run parallel to the street.
Right, but we're not talking about the front yard, we're just talking about the side.
We're talking about the side yard.
So
Side and front yard.
we need to understand that out here along this frontage, it's the front yard. And the idea would be that in the front yard, no fence would be more than 30 inches high. Over here in the side yard, it's an interior side yard, so there's another lot and house here. And so typically over here, the height limit is 6 feet. You don't have to have it low, you can have it high. And the rear yard runs completely across. So you notice that the side yard is just a short area on the side of the house. And the side yard adjacent to a street is again, a short area just on the side of the house. The front yard is completely across, the rear yard is completely across. And so what the code language allows or is saying is on a side yard adjacent to a street, it's talking about this area here. And so
Actually,
if we're talking about,
doesn't it go all the way through the curb fence? Coming adjacent section.
We need to address this so that I think, Jim, I think simplification is probably the best way to go.
I do, and right, and universal regulations are not simple. What is simple is having a standard for the front yard, a standard for the rear yard, a standard for an interior side yard, and a standard for a side yard adjacent to a street.
And what you've got there, if I go by what you're saying, I would look at the description just gave us, you'd have the side yard, but then you'd have the rear side yard adjacent to the street.
But that's, he's calling it the rear yard.
And then you'd have the rear fence
Right.
within 10 feet that's adjacent. Yeah,
What I probably need to do, it sounds like we're not gonna get to a resolution tonight. So, but I mean, other cities have no problem with this. And this language is it's a run-on sentence. And it has to be a run-on sentence because it's trying to be a universal fence standard. So it's talking about, you know, with the exception of some fences, all fences, hedges, and walls shall not exceed a height of 3 1/2 feet within 10 feet of any property line adjacent to a street.
and the only reason I made the suggestion I did is it
So if
allows
we can focus
a person to
on
get to
the
6
issue assigned to us, and on the side yard adjacent to a street, and granted, it's only this area right here. And there is still this area that's the rear yard adjacent to a side property line adjacent to a street. But if we can take the first piece of this and say, do we want to keep the current standard for this? Or is it okay to have a fence in this area up to 6 feet high, clear out to the property line? Yes or no? Let's get over that one first. And then we'll know if he's either preferred or not. And then this little piece here, we can presumably allow here, whatever we allow here, although you may not want to, there might be some desire to make something different for that portion of the rear yard. But to try to get some little bit of consensus as a basic point so that then we can go on to the next thing, I think we should focus on the problem that was here for the variance. And a couple of the planning commissioners said, I don't know about these rules. Are those really what we want?
But it opens a big, obviously it opens a bigger question. It opens a bigger question, and we're better off addressing, rather than doing things piecemeal. I mean, maybe we want to ultimately write it down that way, but rather than piecemeal, let's solve the problem, not teeny bits. Yes, Joe.
He was first.
Yes, Mike.
Well, I'm kind of happy with what we have on the books right now. I think it's fair. I think it's been, nobody's really questioned it, except for this.
Up until
couple
now,
of-
that's true. So,
All right, but it just doesn't seem, it seems like we're taking an issue, which was just one person out of 4,000 people who wants to build a fence. He's been denied a variance by the planning commission. He's been denied a variance by the city council. Now, it was suggested we change the wording of the side yard, but what he made was not a bad suggestion as far as a compromise. But what scares me about this is they can say, well, I'll do this, but I'll have the half of my fence be able to see through it. But if somebody needs to be able to, the wording in that would have to suggest that we would have to have some control of what they do, because who knows what they put up there.
and once it gets into design choices for the people,
Then they'd have to submit plans. I mean, we're making this more complicated than it really is.
okay. So then,
So
your
it's not a
thought,
bad compromise. It's not a bad compromise.
your
but-
thought is, maybe we're making much ado about nothing.
Yes.
Maybe we should.
But-
Even though somebody's really happy, it's something that does work for all of Lafayette.
And it has so far, except for this one person.
Well, right, but overall,
Yes.
with the
I think
exception of one
the
situation.
wording that's in there right now is appropriate, and it seems like
They want to
it's
bring their fence line up to the
Yes,
front of
Joe.
their front of their house.
So I think it's more than just one person wasn't happy. The commission asked us to relook at it. They said it's.
That's
old.
true.
We should relook at it.
Or somebody on the commission also thought, it's worth it. Now, the
Council.
commission asked us to look at it. That doesn't necessarily mean that we need to change that. It just means they want another set of eyes on it.
But I think also if we look at just the focal point of it, and if it's just that side yard, and if we're only thinking about that right now, like you said, is to make a decision on that, that doesn't mean we have to stop. Then we could say, okay, what about this other part?
Then
How do
but
address
then
that?
it drags on and drags on and drags and goes on, and it would take more
But
time.
I don't necessarily, I appreciate your option, but I think it could make fences really expensive. It could make them look funny or weird, how people decide to create that visual
Yeah, so who
space.
would be in charge of making sure that it would be, that it will be, it would look normal, or you don't want something so odd that, people would drive here just to see the fence.
The issue of, when it comes to the issue of design,
No.
that's that artistic side of things. That is up to the homeowner. That's not what the city doesn't say. If people want something like that, then that's where you can have HOAs or not.
Okay.
So I would say that would be something that goes beyond the purview of what the city should say. Let me do something here too. Doreen,
Yes.
you've been listening to this and scratching your head. What are your thoughts?
Well, like he said, I mean, it's worked so far and we have one person that has asked to change things. And it has worked so far. It's a safety, you can see well the way things are. There's no safety issue with things the way they are. Now, by changing everything, then you, in a way, you open a can of worms to a lot of other people wanting to do a lot of different things.
George, your thoughts?
Well, I went and looked at his lot. He wants to change it up to the front of the house.
Well, right, that was the front,
So
that's
he's
the whole
already
side, that's
considering-
the
But
side
that's
yard.
not what- We're only talking about.
That's the side
code.
yard. He's not going
Side
into the
yard.
front yard. He's going
Yeah,
up to the front of the
that's
house.
still adjacent to the street.
Yeah, it's still adjacent to the street, but
So
he's not
yeah,
going
he
in.
just drew it in red.
Yeah, that's what he's doing, yes.
All that fence right there is 6 foot high.
And what we're
So
saying is that
if
a
we're
good,
saying the code only is dealing with the street side roads. Do we give him the exception for that little section in the rear part to be 6 foot tall? And
Well,
everything
that's what
else?
the original fence was. That's what he tore down and replaced.
right, and based on what I read,
But
that
that already violates the code.
that violated the code.
Probably
So-
grandfathered in.
But it wasn't
What Mr.
because the
Jackson's-
fence was built, the code existed long before the
Okay.
fence, whoever
Mr.
built the fence
Jackson's
before.
suggestion is that we treat the rear yard separate. Come up with a standard just for the rear yard and say, that's fine, make all fence in the rear yard 6 foot tall, correct?
No, I think he's saying, let's
Separate
address the
by-
rear yard separate from the side yard.
Yeah, but if you're gonna create a standard for the rear yard, you'd want the whole.
Right now, basically, even though this language that's in the code has some inherent problems, and, we're discovering more and more, but basically, in the front yard, the fence height is 3.5.
Unless you're in a corner lot.
No, the front is still,
The front is three, if anywhere,
This is a corner lot, and the front yard is this area. And the maximum height basically is 30 inches. The rest of this over here, the side yard, interior side yard, and the rear yard, 6 feet. Other than due to the language that Ron pointed out tonight, it's like, oh yeah, it seems to be saying that this little piece of the rear yard fence is also limited to 30 inches in height when it's within 10 feet.
That's what you
This
told me
line.
last time. Is that was.
I can tell you, most of the city codes and the council of governments where I work, we do the small city planning for like 21 or 22 cities in Marion, Polk, and Yamhill counties. And none of them have language like this.
So,
I don't know why this hasn't come up as a problem before, but it hasn't.
because
And
nobody
so
violated
the idea is, other than in the front yard where it's limited in height, everywhere else you can be up to 6 feet. And then when you get to a corner lot, okay, front limited in height, everywhere else 6 feet, except, oh yeah, this side yard over here. Well, I don't know, for some reason, this language says if you're within 10 feet of this side property line, you have to have no more than a 3.5 foot high fence. And like you've probably all seen around town, and if you drove by the property that was the subject for the variance, they've moved the fence out of the right of way and put it where they were requesting the variance to allow them to put it. And so the fence would be like this, and it could be 6 feet high. And that is pretty typical with what other fence regulations are. And it's not just small cities that I'm familiar with, but bigger cities where I live in Kaiser, and they allow basically 6 foot high fences everywhere except in the front yard and in a for some people who think the side yard is this whole area, and they allow the 6 foot high fence there too, except where it's coming down into the front yard. Sorry, that probably didn't sound as
No, that makes sense.
understandable as I wanted it to sound.
They would allow that where you've got your red draw, they would allow that 6-foot fence on the side to come down just to where it meets the plane in the front of the house and stop there.
Yeah, I mean, it's not an issue, and I don't know why with this language in the code, I assume that what staff has been doing over the decades is thinking about, okay, what it looks like this is talking about is 6 feet everywhere except in the front, and then on the side, adjacent to a street, it's got to be, a reduced height. So I'm just thinking that a standard for the front, a standard for the interior side, a standard for the rear, a standard for a side adjacent to a street. That would make it clear to anybody reading it.
Let me ask you, do you have either language or would you be able to pull from some of the language that you're thinking of for interior yard, side yard adjacent to the street, rear yard that's 10 feet away from the street? Do you have the ability to craft the language in that direction?
Other jurisdictions, there's only 242 cities in the state.
And 243.
Less than 10 or 20 people, but it's pretty standard to have fence standards and a development code. And generally, the standard is you can build a 6-foot high fence anywhere you want on your property, except in the front yard where it's down in this 2.5 foot figure, or 3.5 foot figure is the one that's in a lot of the codes. That if we're not able to come to consensus tonight about what to do with the side yard, then we can continue the discussion into March. And I can give you examples from other cities as to what their language is. And a view to getting rid of this run-on sentence that has some inherent inconsistencies in it.
Just a second, Jim. Mike,
Yeah, well, I would like to.
you want to put your pen up there?
Well, actually, I just want to show. How about a compromise where we just say we can only have it 6 foot to the front, and that's it. In the front of them.
That's what's drawn up there, the round line.
Is that exactly what's on the books now?
No. What's on the books now is that's what we're talking about. What's on the books is
What I'm saying is, why don't we just have, he can have a 6 foot fence up to the front of the house line.
I think that's what this.
Yeah, that's, yeah.
red line,
When we're
is that what
talking,
that's saying?
when we're talking about,
The
Okay.
proposed language, I think that's what it's saying.
I think it should be 10 feet from the front property line, not to the front of
But it
the house.
doesn't say to the front of the house.
well, the front property, well, okay, you're saying to the front.
Not all houses are created equal on the lots.
I was looking.
Well,
at
no,
the-
by stopping at the front plane of the house, then it doesn't matter. Some people have a 10-foot yard, others have a 30-foot, keeps it out of the front yard entirely, front of the house entirely.
That's for the January meeting.
Right, it's, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And all I was trying to do by my compromise was make it so that
Yeah, I'm trying to find, this is what. the
you could have,
proposed
you wouldn't have private, the person wouldn't have privacy side of things, but they'd have the ability to have their animals outside the side yard and all that. Because I do think if we have solid fencing, just a minute, Jim, I do think if we have solid fencing like that in the side yard next to the street, that I can't help but think that if somebody's got a driveway right next to that rear fence,
But
that
it
could
says
be an
it
issue.
Has to
Well,
apply with the.
right, clear vision, okay,
That's
so
in
that satisfies that.
Yeah.
That is correct.
And that is in there, it's stated.
And so then if somebody has their driveway that's so many feet away from that spot, they wouldn't be able to build a fence there in that location anyhow. They had to have to adjust their fencing. They might have to exaggerate, they might have to chop off a corner of that rear yard being fenced in to meet that requirement if it came out. So if we went, yes, I'm sorry, George. Yes, George.
I know we're focusing on the street side of the property, but I don't go and go to your little drawing here. But I'm also asking, are we going to include this in the modification? All of this could be 6-foot things.
The other side and the interior don't need any modification.
Well, yes, it does, because it can't go beyond the 10-foot margin either.
Well, no, it could, but that's in the front yard. That's the front
In
yard.
the front yard, wherever,
Okay,
from
so
the front property line, basically to the front of the house is the front yard. And in that entire area, you're limited to 30 inches.
yeah. Now, my next question is, why do we care if this is chain link or solid fence here? Because I went past the house and it drove past it, going both directions. Doesn't obscure anything. Basically blocks the property. I wouldn't want it for myself, but that's just me.
So
I
that,
don't know why that has to be.
so we don't.
Now, the front yard and the safety zone goes across corner to corner.
Yeah, I don't know what happens for those things. They run out pretty quick.
So
We'll
I,
make the safety zone green.
so
Just
That's the only thing that's got state code that's for the safe, for the viewing, right? View, what they call it, viewing.
Supposedly to ensure that nothing very high is in that green triangle so that a vehicle
Can see.
southbound coming to the intersection can look right and see if there's any vehicles coming.
So that's the only section that really has any regulatory requirement.
well, but the front yard has the city regulatory requirements and
But
30
we're
inches.
discussing changing that though.
No, we are not
Not the
discussing
front.
changing that. We don't change
Talking
that.
about the front.
We're not talking about the front.
Well, I understand that, but I'm saying this is the only one that has state level regulatory as far as safety
Well,
issue.
that's our local code.
Well, didn't you say that that's a state or whatever code require that viewing?
Well, if you are
Safety
going,
zone.
if a jurisdiction is going to install a stop sign, then in the traffic world, not the land use planning fencing world, but in the traffic world, they have some standards. And if you're gonna have a stop sign, some of the things you have to consider is what all is in the area that might block a person's view.
Okay.
And then what is the speed allowed on the cross street? And what's the speed on the road that you might go to stop sign?
Currently,
on?
right now, this is the only area that's got the 30 inch
Right,
requirement.
yes.
Anywhere else can be 38 inches.
Yeah, 42 inches, 3.5 feet.
That would be, yeah. But so all I'm saying is, I understand what you're saying, make the code right, rear property sides, and front, if we say the front yard is anything back behind 10 feet from the property line, and limit that only to the 30-inch requirement. Would that also be this section right here?
Well, if
That's
we
between
write it
two
that way,
properties.
that it would.
We could write it that way, or you could just write it so that in the front yard,
If we're talking about simplifying the code, that would simplify it. We say, these can be all 6 foot. These two can't be higher than 30 inches. Front yard.
Well, that's the way the city staff has been interpreting this is the front yard, 30 inches, 2.5 feet. Everywhere else can be up to 6,
Unless you're on a corner lot.
and the side yard adjacent to a street.
But I don't see a need for the side yard.
Side yard adjacent to a street,
so
you
the,
need to have a.
so
30-inch limit.
the issue is, we're not talking about the front yard. We don't care about
The
that.
front yard's under.
Front yard's not on the table.
I'm saying if we make it, break it down where it talks about rear yard side, it'd be simplified just to say that all this can be 6-foot fence.
Yeah.
How they make it, what they make it of,
Yeah,
why do we care? If there's no safety issue with a higher fence there.
that's the agreement of the planning commission, then
And
So
then
that's
this
the
right
front
here,
yard.
only,
everywhere else can be 6 feet.
so we make this rest of that 30-inch requirement, that way we don't have two sizes of fences for the front yard, just simplify that.
Well,
Because I look up at the properties around town and we're hodgepodge everywhere.
Oh, well, that's true.
And I look at this, I go by it both directions. As long as they're 10 feet from the front property line. Put up to 6-foot fence, make it out of rock. Whatever. It has to be a nice looking fence, of course, but
Okay, yeah.
chicken wire fence won't work.
Joe, you had a question?
Yeah, I can't remember right now.
I'm
But
sorry.
I was just thinking.
I didn't call you fast enough, but I also didn't want to interrupt George. Or
No, that's fine. Yeah, I was thinking, I liked what he was saying, so.
Let me ask a question while you think about yours. Doreen,
Yes,
been drawing on the whiteboard up here, as you can probably guess, if somebody walks off the side of your screen.
yeah, I can't see what's being written up there.
Even if we turn it
I mean,
down.
I'm to follow, but as far as the drawing itself, I cannot see.
Okay, but does everything from a verbal discussion make sense to you or not?
I was having a difficult time understanding George.
It's
But-
probably like that on
No, right now,
Hey, Jim,
the entire front
Jim?
is limited in height.
Yeah, you had a question, Joe?
Oh, I was just
I'll
thinking,
come back to you, Doreen.
of the language instead of how it exists now, where it says within 10 feet of any property line, you just said within 10 feet of a front property line,
Within 10 feet of what?
a front property line.
We're not talking about a front property line. The code, we're working with side yard lines, not front.
I think we added side.
No, we did not. It says
That's in the-
side yard adjacent to a street.
That's in the bold. And then we added it.
The fun with language.
I was looking at last month's notes, and in there, a side yard is bolded.
Right, because we're talking a side yard.
But I thought
Right.
bolding,
Right.
I thought bolding that we added it.
Yeah, and this was from last month before Ron had a chance tonight to point out that this code language where it says within 10 feet of any property line adjacent to a street was not in mind when this was written. And this, from the January staff report, a possible solution was to say that the fences, walls, and hedges shall not exceed a height of 6 feet within a side yard adjacent to a street.
But that's not the current code now. That's.
No.
Right.
That was
This is what was proposed as a possible fix for the commission to consider. And because we got derailed big time last month, we never even talked about this. And so,
But so I'm saying, if that isn't in the code yet,
right,
we don't have to have that in the code. It doesn't have to say a side yard.
no, it's a possible
That's what,
amendment
right.
to
So
fix the situation.
So what
if
I
we
was
want to
saying-
Fix it.
instead of adding the side yard, say the 3.5 or whatever, 30 inches within 10 feet of a front property line.
But we're not talking about a
Adjacent
front,
to the
we're not talking about a front property line. We're not working
What
on a
he's
front.
saying
property.
is, if it says within 10 feet of a front property line, That means everywhere else can be 6.
On what I said up there.
Yeah, that's what
Okay,
you were saying.
okay,
That's what-
going the other direction instead of, okay, it's taking and changing it, making the change so that the fence a fence that is in a front yard of a property to within 10 feet of that front property line can be 30 inches, everywhere else
Yeah,
6 feet.
Should be
But
6 feet.
just that little fix of the current code.
right, but here's the other issue of that. If we go 10 feet from that front property line, you would then have a 6-foot fence that potentially would come in front
That's what this is.
of the house.
Well, a typical front yard is 20 feet deep. And
That's why I would say if you want to change, if we want to make the
Several-
distinction between front yard and everything else, then look at the front plane of the house as being like Jim is getting at that front plane of the house.
Yeah.
Designate front from rear. So you bring those side yards up to the point of the front of the house and then stop. And then go totally 90 degrees perpendicular over to the
Well,
side
from
of
a
the
design
house.
Point of view, that's how you would put in a fence
so
anyway.
if I could digress a little bit. Traditionally, for I don't know how many decades, front yard setbacks were 20 feet. And so for a lot of decades, home builders would say, okay, I'm going to build a house. The garage door is going to be at 20 feet. It's going to be the salient architectural feature of this house because the house is going to be like in an L shape and the rest of the house will be more than 20 feet back. So,
Completely.
Portland refers to that type of design as a snout house, but that is like you say, that is
So-
typically the way houses have been built for the last 75 years. Well,
so
50
many
some-
houses were built like this.
Yes.
And going back about to probably 25 years ago, some people were thinking about, well, why do our single-family neighborhoods look like they do? And how can we more efficiently use the land on each lot? And so they thought, well, this 20-foot setback, what's so sacrosanct about that? Okay, well, what's sacrosanct about it is if you have a garage here, it's full of stuff. And so people park their cars out here and a typical car is generally not longer than 20 feet, although these long wheelbase SUVs and pickup trucks and vans are a little more than 20 feet. So that's kind of a
That's
problem
changing.
these days, but
That's changing because people's tastes are changing.
yeah, back then it was like, okay, so 20 feet. Well, what about if we say a house can come 5 feet closer? And so you use up some of the front yard that people don't seem to want to be out there and play games anymore. They seem to want to be in the backyard with their barbecues and things like that, a little more private and so forth. Some people don't even know the neighbors next door, so they're not really interested in doing their family play day out in the front yard. They want to do it back where it's more private. So this comes out here 15 feet, and this line comes in. They gain some area in their backyard where they would like more usable land. And so as part of that movement, so to speak, your Lafayette code now for the R1, R2, and R3 zones has a 15-foot front yard setback. So most of your housing stock is built like this with a 20-foot, but a lot of the newer stuff in the last, I don't know when that was amended, 10 years ago or 12 or probably not 15, but 10 or 12 years ago, the new front yard setback was adopted. So I don't know how many of the new housing units have used the 15-foot setback, but when we're talking about a fence and if we're talking about new housing, then we're thinking 15 feet. Sorry. And so the way the code is written now, these fences and things shall not exceed a height of 3½ feet within 10 feet of any property line adjacent to a street. So any property line adjacent to a street within 10 feet, we got a property line here and a property line here. And here's the area that's within 10 feet. That's limited to 2½ feet. Is that, oops, 2½ or
The code says 3.5.
3½? Sorry.
It's 2.5 for the corners. It's 30 inches for the corners.
Okay, I'm not gonna worry about the
Yeah, we're not gonna worry about
for right now.
now.
I don't want to make this any more complicated than it is. So the current code seems to be saying that they didn't really care what's going on in this 10-foot area as long as it's 3.5 feet in height, no more. So 3.5 within 10 feet. So here's the 10 feet, here's another 10 feet, and that's the 20-foot setback to the house. So over here, we got another house, but it's closer, it's only 15 feet away. So the 10-foot setback is 10 feet here, 5 feet there. And if somebody wants to have a 3.5-foot fence out at the front property line, and they go back 10 feet, well, they can have a 6-foot high fence, is what the code now allows, whether it's front yard or side yard. A lot of, like I've been mentioning, a lot of cities in the front yard, from the front property line back to the house, which typically has been 20 feet, the whole thing is limited to 3.5 feet. But in the Lafayette code, it says, well, yeah, in the first 10 feet of the front yard, you're limited to 3.5, but then you can put up a 6-foot high fence for the second 10 feet. I'm not sure if that was really intentionally done or if it was just kind of an accident of the way the code language was written. But
So basically, we need to define what a front yard is.
no, we know what the front
We know
yard
it.
is.
So you're saying it varies from property to property.
No.
If we limit the front yard to a 10-foot
Right
setback.
now, once the code changed the 20-foot front yard setback to 15, the front yard setback for every house in R1, R2, and R3 is 15 feet. It's just that the older housing is 20 feet back. So they could come in for an addition, a 5-foot addition, meet the 15-foot front yard setback, whereas before they wouldn't have been able to do a.
We don't care about the houses, we just want to know where to stop the fence.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. We're working on a fence.
Yeah, so
So
the official, legal, one and only front yard setback is 15 feet these days.
So,
But we just need to be aware of the history
Yeah.
and realize that half the housing stock is set back 20 feet, not 15. And it's because of history where whatever, a dozen years or more ago, the setback was 20.
I think we set the code to define what the front yard is for fencing purposes only. Say that it has, within 10 feet of the front yard property line is limited to 36, 42, or 30-inch fence, whatever we decide on.
We
And
can,
then everything else can be 10-foot, 6-foot.
that would allow some side fencing to come into the front yard.
We don't care. As long as they stay behind the property line by 10 feet, we don't care what they do. What is the setback?
Because I mean, think about, sorry.
What's the setback for the corner lots?
the side yard adjacent to a street is 15 feet,
No, what's the fence for that safety zone?
20-foot legs.
It's 20-foot lengths? Okay, so that violates the 10-foot right there. So that meets the old housing limit. Where you had to be 20 feet back.
Okay, so
So-
let's,
But with the code saying that it has to be in the visual impaired zone, that would take care of that.
yeah, yeah, George, here's a way to handle that clear vision section. And that is
Let me check on the clear vision.
the code, the reference to clear vision is going to dictate. City hall will review any design that comes in. And if the fence is too high in that, even if it was back in that 6-foot corner, if it is too high, they will tell the person, you can't build it that high. And that's, we don't need further discussion on that item.
Well,
It's decided and done.
it just seems simple just to define the front yard for the purpose of the fence. It's 20 yards back, and if they can't build a fence all the way to the front edge of their house, big deal. They have to stay behind the 20-foot length from the front property line. As far as the fence goes, they can move the house
I
up
wouldn't-
50 feet all they want. but
I wouldn't define, see, that's just it. I wouldn't define what the front yard is. I would simply
Well,
use,
we were trying to simplify the code that would apply to both corner lots and inside lots. And if the corner lots are limited to 20 feet from the front of their property line for that small section of property for 30 inches, wouldn't it be simpler to identify all properties equally that have to have a fence back 20 feet?
Or just say that.
As far as the front yard fencing area is concerned, it's 20 feet from the front property line.
then if you get to the interior yard and the house is at that 15-foot and then they have to go back 5 feet before they can go.
No,
Now you've treated that creates the reverse problem of what we're dealing with tonight.
How's that create a reverse problem?
if it's an interior lot, there's no vision clearance triangle because it's an interior lot.
Right, but what George is proposing is to make it so that if you're 20 feet from the front yard on both sides, it's 20 feet back that you have to go. So his would, like I say, if the house front is at 15 feet, he would say on that interior side yard with 20 feet from that front property line, you have to stay at 30 inches. Now you've moved that front yard fence, as you want it, 5 feet behind the front of the house. That creates the problem that we're trying to solve on the side yard right now tonight. It just shifts the problem.
Even though for a long time, the front yard setback was 20, it's only 15 now.
And that's
So
why I
the front
say,
yard setback is 15 feet.
and that's why I say I keep referencing the front plane of the
I
house.
understand what you're saying, but I'm saying that a person on the corner lot is limited on 2 sides of their front corner of their lot. So
That is true. That is
And
true.
if we're trying to simplify the code that it applies to every property in town, if we limit it, that front fence, by definition for fencing only, that it's 20 feet from the front property line. We've got one code that says every other fence around the property can be 6 foot tall, but in that front zone, front property zone, it has to be on.
And as long as,
30 inches, leave it at that.
and
That
I
applies to both corner lots and applies to inner
And I
lots.
would agree with you, except for trying to define from that front property line, trying to specify what that setback is. Because for some houses, it'll be 18 feet, some 12, some 20, some
Well, I
5.
don't care. I'm saying that
I'm just saying, now if you
if they
say,
stop at 20 feet from the front property line,
not the 20 feet, no, that's where you lose me.
well,
If you said from the front property line to the front plane of the house,
but that doesn't work for a corner lot.
but it would work for some, it wouldn't work for
No, it
others.
would not work for corner lots because they
How do you
all
know?
fall under the requirement of 20 feet back.
How do you know?
Not all corner lots, the older houses on a corner. For example, when this house was built, I would guess that there's a 20-foot front yard setback there because that is what the front yard setback was when it was built.
Yeah, just a minute.
Because it
Jim?
also had to be back then 20 feet from the side. Then this comes back 20 feet, comes over 20 feet, like that. Because the house is over this triangle doesn't impede this house. It only affects a fence if they want to stick it out in the front yard.
Joe, you have a question?
Yeah, so the current, if we look at the current language of the code, it actually doesn't talk about corner lots. It doesn't talk about
No,
side
that
yards.
becomes
It's just
another-
any yard adjacent to a street.
Yeah, just-
And so
Mhm.
if we don't think about that, if we just think about it's any and try to fix that problem.
Because it could be a rear, it could be a rear yard. That's
It's
just,
only the front yard, like you drew, like you talked about,
But
and we just,
You don't understand, there's another section in the code that deals with the safety, you
right.
okay.
And
What is
all
the
fences have to
proper-
comply
I'm
with
sorry.
that. Every fence has to
Everything,
comply with that.
so I'm at this point, I don't like to do this, but I'm going to. When it comes to bringing the safety triangle into the discussion, you'll hear a response to me, and that is, it's asked, it's answered. We don't need to, we are not considering it in this meeting. That is not part of what we're doing.
you're telling me you want to create a code that is universal throughout the city.
That was one thought.
I was trying to come up with. a way
And I agree with
Find
that, but
the-
I'm not
Right.
going to let the safety issue is not going to, it's not the
Then
tail
you're
that's
not
gonna wag the
you're not-
dog.
Then you're not trying to create a universal code for those.
The safety thing trumps every fence.
Right. If they decide to
It
fence,
only trumps the corner lots.
It trumps all of us.
I would,
We have to have a
here's what I would do then, based upon blending your proposal. It sounds like you would, because of what you said, you would consider, let's let a 6-foot fence be in a side yard on the lot line, as
Yes.
opposed, so you consider that as an alternative.
But it shouldn't. It shouldn't.
But
The safety is the first.
Okay,
We have to worry about safety. That's number one.
no, we got in this tangent last week. We worried about safety. Safety is already taken care of. Whatever
Yes.
we do here tonight, got a little statement that we'll make sure there is, subject to a clear vision triangle. That's it. If the fence has a little corner that gets chopped out of it, it gets chopped out of it. That's
Yes.
it. That's the way it goes. End of story.
any street adjacent or any lot.
Any place. Done. We don't, it doesn't matter whether they got a 20-foot front yard or a 12-foot front yard. Done. The fence is gonna drip. Done. We're not trying to make the fence based upon the triangle. We're gonna let them design the fence, and the triangle is gonna dictate what they have to change.
I'm saying the triangle would just be a starting point.
No,
Where the front yard points. I'm saying that right now, there's a separate code that only affects corner lots. It does not affect, yes, it does. It only affects the corner lots. They're the only ones that have to have that.
Which one is it?
I don't remember where.
I don't see anything that talks about a corner
It
lot.
doesn't say, it says somehow we've got side yard adjacent to street. Yes, that's going to be a corner lot for some properties, but
But
that is
that's
not going to
that's
be,
what's proposed. That's not the actual language.
that's not the angle language.
Language is, fences and things shall not exceed a height of 3 1/2 feet within 10 feet of any, and this is what you pointed out at the beginning of the meeting,
Any,
within 10 feet of any property line adjacent to a street.
so
So it means
side yard, front yard, rear yard.
It means this one and this one for a corner lot. And I hesitate to mention this, but there are some things, sometimes the subdivision is laid out and there's a lot that's called a through lot. It has frontage on one street, and then the backyard, the back property line has frontage on another street. Subdividers don't like to do that because it's an inefficient use. You want a road that's double loaded, houses on each side. But occasionally they get caught in a situation where just the way the land is, they got a road here and they gotta put a road here, and there's only enough room for one lot. It's a through lot with the rear lot line on one street, the front lot line on another street. So it's not a very common thing, but this language in the current code is you're limited to 3.5 feet when you're within 10 feet of any property line adjacent to a street. And so
And must comply with
that's
the
the
applicable
situation
provision.
here, regardless of where the house is. Some houses have a 25 or 30 foot front yard setback. They just have a big lot and they wanted their house way back, so they put it way back. And so going to the front elevation of the house isn't gonna fit all houses in town, but if you talk about limiting the height in the front yard, which is now 15 feet, or the way the code language is now, you go back 10 feet, you're limited in height, but once you're past 10 feet, you can go 6 feet.
Which is currently what it is. I mean, I can have a 6-foot fence in the front of my yard if I'm 10 feet from.
Correct, correct.
Yes, question.
Yes, I'm sorry.
I think we're just making this far more complicated than it really is.
Yes.
Basically, why don't we I suggest that we just have forget about changing the wording of what's in there. And if people have a problem with the fence, they can apply for a variance. And we'll just leave the language the way it is.
And the problem we run into that is the way the language is now, the variance that was proposed that brought it back to us, there's no way for city council, even at a city council level, for them to grant a variance because that variance would never cross the threshold of what would be allowed. That's why.
It's already you're right. If somebody wants to change one fence, they can apply for a variance. I mean, it's 99% of the people who have built fences aren't complaining about this.
They didn't ask for permission.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because they're out there.
They either didn't
I
ask
walk
for
my
permission.
dog through the neighborhood all the time. There's only one, there's probably 2 fences in the entire city of, no, actually there's 3 fences where you have a fence on the property line. We're taking this way out of proportion, and we're supposed to be focusing on the side yard, and that's it. I don't see a whole lot of changes that's going to make a difference if we leave the language the way it is and let people apply for a variance.
That was the problem. They don't have the right to.
The variance criteria are so difficult and stringent that you gotta have like a really steep upslope or downslope or some big rock outcrop in your property or something inherent with the land that causes you to not be able to comply with the code requirement. And there's hardly any place in town that would fit that criteria. And the variance request was basically, they want privacy and they wanted some extra space in their yard. They didn't want to have a fence back 10 feet, which
In effect, our code
was a 20-foot setback.
in effect, our code is so restricted right now, and the variance process, while it's there, the variance process that we have relative to code, we would not have situations where a person the variance could be asked, but it could never be granted. So in effect, it is the way it is, it would not, and that's the way it would be.
Yeah, with this house, if we're assuming it's a 20-foot side yard setback, and they've got to come in 10 feet to be able to put a 6-foot high fence up. Well, they've only got 10 feet here of usable yard space. And that was one of their points. If they could have the fence out at the property line, 6 feet high, then they'd have 20 feet of usable space in their side yard. And it would be private because they'd have a 6-foot fence, well, like the wood fence that is there, and people wouldn't be able to see in probably the activities of the family.
Does that property have sidewalks?
No,
So what have you noticed that there's quite a few new sidewalks that they're putting in?
Little by little, they are getting sidewalks in.
Basically, if they want to change that, I mean, if they want to have it on the property line, what happens if they put a sidewalk on that?
The sidewalk goes on the other side of the property.
the sidewalks in the public right of way.
Sidewalks in the public right of way, then from what I understand, the
Okay.
fence is out of the public right of way.
Okay,
So, but again, this is not about a specific property. This is about all of Lafayette.
So
So go, okay, so Joe, go
our
ahead.
current code says that we can have a 6-foot fence 10 feet from the front property line. So,
Well, it says adjacent to the road.
She's talking about.
right, but you can do that now. So,
But on a corner like that, side yard is also adjacent to the road. Is what he's trying to point out, is that fence has. to be
right,
back
no, I know,
there.
but then they could, like they said, I mean, they could have a 6-foot fence all the way around their whole house if they went here and here.
But that's not what they want. They wanted.
We're not- I'm not talking
We're
about
not
one
talking
person.
about that.
I'm talking about just in general, that's how it would be. I mean,
Yes.
that's what we could do right now.
Right now, correct. That's the way, that's what the code would allow us.
Right. And so if we just focus on the 10-foot back from the property line, your fence has to be about 30 inches or whatever, unless you're 10 feet back in the front yard,
Well, adjacent to
the street.
a property line next to a street.
Right, right. And so if you just say that, and then the rules about this would take care of any issue going that far over. I mean, it's that simple in my head.
Yeah, well, what you're describing is this, which is what the code language actually says.
Yeah.
It says,
But just address it as the front yard, not any street, any property adjacent
What
to
we're
the street.
discussing, but we haven't determined how far back the front yard to go.
We don't.
and for those people on a corner lot that would like to have more usable space in this area,
It-
then
the
we would
20
need to say something about that.
Let me,
Well, the 20 feet here would force them back beyond the 10 feet.
Right. Yeah, like. but
right. And so we let the clear vision, we don't try to dictate something based upon what the clear vision is.
No, I know, but that's what I'm
We just
saying. If you
set
say
the code
10
and
feet
let-
back,
yeah.
then anything that's in violation of that is already taken care of.
Let me do this. Doreen,
I'm here.
I keep wanting to get your input.
I know, I'm trying hard to follow everything without being able to see much.
Not much really to see.
What can I do to solve this? Damn
Well, is that the camera she's watching?
it. Let's do this.
Hand it over.
I'm gonna try, I'm gonna try.
Aren't we supposed to be reviewing the ordinance to see if it would benefit the whole city, not just one homeowner?
Yeah, people keep bringing up the individual owner, and that's what's triggered this. But this has to apply to all of Lafayette.
Right, that's what I was saying.
Doesn't though. That's one lot comes under a different rule. Period.
And
It's an interesting.
I'm going to try something. Okay, Reed, you'll have to let me know, because I can't see you, so you'll have to let me know. Can you see them? Can you see this drawing at all? With the two-
Yes. Yes,
House in the center?
Yep.
Front yard, side yard, rear yard, could be any property. In this case, if this is a street out here, which would be the case, this would be considered a side yard adjacent to the street.
right.
The issue is right now, our code says if you are at this point, this is 10 feet
Right.
back from the property line. That fence can be 6 feet high.
Right.
Here, it can be 3.5 feet. It has to be nowhere, okay. The question that's come up is, the city council kickback is, should we change it so that in this area, we can go to 6 feet? Or do we want to leave the code alone?
Right.
So that's kind of what's been drawn over on the whiteboard. Over there. Does this fill in any gaps for you?
Yeah, I mean, But,
We're not-
and we're not,
Does say
and
that.
we're talking about the entire city, correct? Not just one specific
Correct,
home.
It
This
doesn't
needs to apply
matter.
to the entire
We're
city.
dealing with the
The
side yard.
property specific.
That's the
It's
issue.
just a minute, Mike. Property specific applies to what's triggered this event.
Exactly.
Take that triggered event and have it so that it applies to the entire city and for those places where we have
Side yard.
properties with side yards adjacent to a property, or, yeah, adjacent to a street.
Right. Okay, I got it.
And right now, it sounds like, and I'm gonna summarize and see who kind of, if this thinking does kind of summarize what we've got, is we have one of two possible paths. Path one, we do nothing and leave the code the way it is. And, you know, that's, and the way the code is, has worked for a number of years. Yes, one issue has come up. Hasn't apparently for everybody else. Still leaves things, we could still clean up the language a little bit so that, you know, so that we make sure that references are made to clear vision, that we know what the height is, et cetera. The other option would be to basically make two tweaks to the code, and that would be in a front yard area, you could have a fence a maximum of 30 inches in height. I won't specify what that setback would be from the front yard, but just in the front yard area, your fence is limited to a height of 30 inches. And then in all other areas, so long as you're on your property line, it doesn't matter whether it's a side yard, interior, exterior, rear yard, your fence height would be limited to 6 feet.
I like it.
So we got one or two choices, either, and Mike, you came up with basically both of them. One is do nothing, the other is go to 6 feet, right?
Yeah.
So it's, and it sounds like you can see
Either one or
you can
the
see
other.
pros and cons to either one.
Yeah.
So that kind of, does that kind of summarize and
Yes.
sound like what we've been talking about?
Yes.
Can you just mention the first little bit of that?
Oh, the first little bit was step one. The first part was do nothing. We leave the code alone.
After the do nothing,
And then we make sure that the code, that the code has reference to must comply with applicable clear vision requirements.
after that,
And that after that, that the front yard would have a fence height of 30 inches. And then in all other areas, we could have a 6-foot fence. Whether, and it wouldn't matter whether it's a side yard adjacent to street, an interior or a rear yard, it would just be 6 feet all around. So those are kind of, seems to be the two things that we've kind of come to. Does that make sense, Doreen?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that some of the language needs to be cleared up. And personally, I think that I think the code should stay the way it is.
Okay. So from an informal standpoint, okay, I'm going to do this. From an informal standpoint, from the do nothing standpoint, Doreen, how do you feel about that? That's your choice?
I believe we should leave the code how it is.
Okay. George, from an informal standpoint, would you be for or against leaving the code alone?
I would
Not,
like to see the code change.
you would like to see it change, okay?
It needs to be more practical.
Mike, either
Status quo for me.
status quo, okay. Joe,
Change.
change. So we have 2 for change and 2 for status quo. Now, I haven't given my opinion because I can see it both ways. And for me, that's the quandary. I can see it both ways. what I would have to try to think of is what's going to be best for Lafayette. But even if we made a proposal, the city council would have to chew on it. They might come up with their own idea and kick it back as well. So if we went down and said, okay, we're going to make a recommendation to do nothing and sent that to city council, they might kick it back. Or if we made the proposal to change the front yard fence height requirements or restriction to 30 inches, and then in all other yard locations, 6 feet, they might say yes to that, and they might kick it back as well, whichever.
How many, if I don't want to put you on the spot, how many of you have driven by the variant site to see what the fence looks like?
I have.
I have.
I have, at least I think I have.
Okay. And what's the problem with that you see?
I think it looks nice.
I mean, not the look of the fence, but where it's located and that it's 6 feet high.
And if I'm thinking of the place that's,
Located is the brown line.
Yeah.
It opens up, it gives them an extra 10 feet of usable private space here. And is that, I don't know.
it's a brand new fence currently supported on one side by a couple pieces of 2x4, just providing a little extra support. Okay,
Yeah.
I was by that tonight. I saw that.
Yeah, so that's what they were wanting and what they were not able to justify. But the bigger question is, what's wrong with that fence? Why is a 6 foot high fence that's here and here? I mean, what problem is that creating?
I don't think it's fair to the people that have followed the rules.
Well, but they would be able to change too, if they so chose. They would be able to then change
Like
if
when
they
the
wanted.
city changed the front yard setback from 20 to only 15, well, that wasn't fair to everybody that built a house with a 20-foot front yard setback.
Yeah, so
Anytime
that's,
you change a regulation that eases up, well, then a person could say, oh, well, that's not fair to everybody that built under the old rules. So it's basically, what is the problem? Are there going to be what kinds of problems if that fence on the side adjacent to the street is at the property line and 6 feet high?
yes, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just want to say that we say that these are the only people that have roaming around through town, and there's all kinds of properties that have 6 foot fences up to the property line adjacent to the street. It's not just them. What got
Right.
them caught is they extended out into the,
Yeah, they extended into the right of way, and that was caused that, but that triggered a further look. No, I get what you're saying.
it's not being treated, everybody else in the city's being treated unfair. We're trying to set the code where it's a standard code for everybody in town. And that it makes sense. I look at that 6 foot fence, I don't see the problem. I can see around the corner fine. Both ways, it's a nice looking fence, as long as it's maintained, it's gonna be nice looking. It gives them the privacy that they want. I don't see the issue there. As far as everything else, the 30 inch, I think standardizing the front fence to 30 inch fence is an easy adjustment that we can make that simplifies the front fence completely. It's just say it has to be 30 inches no taller. Everything other than 6 foot tall, as long as it maintains the proper area. My only issue is this corner lot, being there with corner lot owners too, which is I am one, which they are one.
So,
And we're limited to 20 feet back because we got that corner.
well, but you could always tweak the fence to account for the little triangle, and that's why I say,
Why tweak it? Why not make it standard for the whole city?
so.
Make it a standard code for every property in the city.
If the current fence height limit, the 3.5 feet 42 inches. That's tall enough to keep most dogs in and things. If you lower it to 30 inches, which is a more restrictive, don't have anything higher than 30 inches in the vision clearance triangle. 30 inches, I'd say most dogs can just hop over that without any trouble at all. And so there is a difference between the fence regulation being set at 42 and the vision clearance being set at 30. Because the vision clearance is thinking of somebody sitting in a car and looking over. And if there's a 42-inch fence, it's going to block their eye view. If it's a 30, then they're going to be able to see over it. So the vision clearance it is what it is because of why,
And just,
safety related.
and just by what you said, it's just by what you have said now, it makes sense that even though 30 inches might be simpler all the way around, there's a functionality 42, a functionality of 30, a functionality to 6 feet. All three of them can work together. They have to be crafted to the property, and that's through the fence permitting process. But all three of them can work together.
Well, it does say, with the exception of not obscuring 4-foot tall fencing. So if you wanted a taller to keep a dog in, you could do the chain link or something.
Which would take you to 48 feet. Or we could drop that, if you want to simplify, we could drop that entirely. They could still put a non-obscuring fence in, but they would then go from 48 to 42 inches.
Ron, quick, can I
Yes,
ask Ron a
yes.
question real quick? Not Ron, Jim. On the 30-inch requirement, why is the chain link fence an issue if you have a 48-inch chain link fence in that safety viewing area? Why is that an issue if it's chain link?
I don't know, other than the vision clearance triangle is 30 inches. And
If you can see through the fence, why is that an issue? I'm asking out of curiosity. I'm not trying to argue.
I mean, speaking out of turn, but I'm going to guess that it boils down to it's the way the law is written, it's the way the law is interpretation, it's the way that law is applied. It has, and the best way to describe it is it's the way the law is written, and that has nothing to do what one thinks of in terms of how it looks or common sense. It's the law, not necessarily common sense.
so let's read what it says about vision clearance. And in that triangle, triangle shall contain no planting, fence, wall, structure, or temporary or permanent obstruction exceeding 2.5 feet, which is 30 inches. So they're talking about, they don't really want anything in there. It's a safety issue. And if some car is going to pull up to a corner and they're going to look upstream to see what's coming on the cross street, well, this little triangle is there for no planting, like no trees, no tall shrub or even a iris that might get more than 30 inches high, no fence of any kind. Just, it says no fence, period. No wall, no structure or temporary or permanent obstruction. So the language is really pretty stiff. Nothing in that area higher than 30 inches.
Yeah. Okay.
That was my question.
So let me ask Commissioner this.
I need to
Yeah,
clarify.
okay, go ahead.
There's more. And it says, except that the following trees, provided branches and foliage are removed to a height at least 8 feet above the telephone pole, power pole, cable television poles, telephone switch boxes, provided they are less than 10 inches wide. I guess they're talking about those little kind of telephone things that stick up
Yep.
2 or 3 feet.
Something that's about 10 inches in
Kind of
diameter.
light
Telephone
gray.
pole would be about 10 inches in diameter.
Yeah, so there are some exceptions, and knowing the trees keep growing and getting bigger, a small tree that's lived up at least 8 feet above the ground, well, someday it's going to have an 18-inch diameter trunk, and then somebody's going to say, I can't really see. I'll just move out a little bit farther so I can look around that tree trunk or the power pole or the telephone pole. So I need to change my statement a minute ago about
You made that clear last.
not anything in there. You can have stuff, some
Certain,
stuff.
certain things that are well defined. Okay.
Well,
If I were to, Go ahead,
to
Joe.
my question about what is the likely problem having a 6-foot high fence over in this side yard area?
not
I
a,
haven't heard, and I've asked it like 3 times now. and
okay,
Nobody is pointing out any problems.
no problem.
They can think of.
So let me do this. Let me do this. And we'll see where it falls. Yeah, and of course, Doreen, I'll go around and ask for a vote, but I'm going to make a proposal, if I can find the language that I want here. I'm going to propose that we initiate. Where's the language at?
Find out what their objections are first.
Oh, the staff report for tonight doesn't have any proposed motions. There might be something in the
Yeah,
January.
I've got it. Okay.
Joe has the January 20th.
And I brought mine with me for that reason. I'm going to move that the planning commission initiate a type 4 legislative process to amend the LZDO section 2.209.09.A3 regarding fences, hedges, and walls in the side yard adjacent to a street to allow a 6-foot fence subject to compliance with clear vision requirements. And to further clarify, well, no, I wouldn't need to clarify the language of the front fence because I wouldn't change the front at this point based upon, like I say, the 42-inch and the 30-inch can work together. There are really some conflict, but they can work together. So, yeah, so my proposal would be that we move to initiate the legislative process to amend the LZDO regarding fences to allow a 6-foot fence in basically all.
Ron, before you. He said he wanted to keep it as it was, and Doreen said that. I'd like to hear why they think it should stay the way it is
Okay,
before we vote on changing it.
okay, I'll hold my motion then for the moment, and we'll also,
And the motion would need a second before you can discuss and vote on it. So we'll,
there's no second, it's just proposed, there's no second. Okay, let's do this, and I'll go in this order. We'll go George, Mike, Doreen, Joe, as far as reasons to keep the code the way it is.
I have no reason to keep the code the way it is. Last time I was with those that disagreed because I wanted to understand the issue.
Okay.
I've gone through town and I've looked at various fences. The only reason this property was brought up is because they vastly went into the right of way and then they caused the problem.
Started
If they had
to,
just put the fence up back, they would be fine. So
Mike,
I like to hear what Mike.
your support of keeping things the same, keeping things the same.
I actually really don't have any offhand. I think you're trying to make this too complicated and we need to simplify this.
Just
Simplify the process, and I think it's okay the way it is now. To
Okay,
change it would just complicate things.
or could introduce complications that, yeah, right, I see that.
Yeah.
Does that make sense when I say could introduce complications?
I think it will cause complications.
Doreen?
Well, that's my question, is by changing this how is it going to affect other existing lots?
It would be grandfathered in, I would assume.
I don't know, I mean, if there's a lot out there that has a fence that's 6 feet high, that's actually on the lot line and is currently in violation of development code, all of a sudden they would be in compliance. If somebody is already is in current compliance with development code and they've got it set back 10 feet, well, they're not going to be harmed because it could be moved if they wanted to. It just means that the way things are, they're still in compliance. If they built a fence out there on the line at 42 inches, or they could change it and raise it up if they wanted to. But even if they didn't, I would have to say that if we did go forward and allow a 6-foot fence in side yards, whether it's adjacent to street, it's more likely that we would have properties fall in compliance than out of compliance. Does that make sense? Your thoughts?
I don't have a thought on that right now.
Okay.
Can I ask her a question?
Yeah, George would like to ask a question, Doreen.
Doreen, have you driven around town and looked at other yards that currently have 6-foot fences along the property?
I haven't specifically driven around town for the purpose of looking at houses with 6-foot fences on side yards. No, I have not.
If you drive around, you'll notice a lot of properties already currently have 6-foot length at the property line. And probably because they didn't ask, or they've been there so long that they pre-exceeded the code in the first place. So the question is, if we're going to be strictly interpreting that code, that we should be going around asking them to move the fence back and shorten it, and whatever else. So that is why, and when I drove by this particular property, the one that started the whole discussion, I don't have a visual issue seeing around that corner with where they propose to put their fence. It looks fine to me. I can see around the corner either way. It doesn't block my view. My only concern is that how we define where the property, where the properties have to start. That can be decided at another time. But my current feeling is that if there's no harm being created by that fence going all the way to the property line, why should we stop them? If that's what they really want. And as long as we have no other reasons for them to keep them forward, why is it an issue? Because if I was to put up a fence around my whole property, I'd want to enclose as much of my property inside the fence as I could too. I'm not going to, but that's how I would wonder if I was going to put up a fence. And I don't want to leave 10 feet outside my property. It creates to me, it makes their work harder to work on the yard. I'm lazy son of a gun. I don't want a fence.
Okay.
So then my purview, let's see. Have you driven around and looked at other properties?
I walk my dog in the neighborhood.
And do any of those fences interfere with what you're thinking? Are they offensive to you? Not a play on words by any of you. Is it offensive? Is something standing out that makes that immediately calls to mind to say that's not right? That's the only thing I'm asking. Is it?
Well, it's my opinion. I'm
trying to understand your opinion.
Please,
I'm sorry.
if you ask me a question, let me answer it.
Okay.
I don't think it's fair to the people who have followed the rules all these years to have someone change it because, well, I thought he actually, when he put his fence in the right of way, I thought he was just thumbing his nose at the city of Lafayette. And it just seemed unfair to the people that follow the rules. He didn't pay for his fence permit. It just seemed like it didn't seem fair to the rest of the people. And that's why I oppose changing this.
So I guess then I suppose one perspective, one way of looking at it would be if we don't change, we're somehow protecting those people that have done and saying to future people, this is the way it's going to be. If we do change, it'll open things up a little bit more for the people that are coming in the future. But it doesn't really harm the people that have done, because they could always change to, they could move their fences or raise the height, whichever the case may be. And then they would, the people that have done, even though they followed the past rules, by changing, they would actually gain more benefit over their property. I don't know, the more I think about it, the more I keep coming up to the conclusion is making that change to a 6-foot fence seems like it's a little more open and allows people to make better use of their property. Does anybody disagree with that?
Mhm. And maybe those people with the 3-foot fence would like a 6-foot fence, and if our codes change, they would.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm coming to. I mean, if the person has a 4-foot fence or that 42-inch fence and they like it, nobody's gonna make them change it. They like it. That's cool. Or if they choose, they could, maybe that's what they had in mind all along, is to build a small fence when they get around there. I don't know. The more I think about it, the more I would say I would go towards towards my proposal of allowing a 6-foot fence, kick that off to the town council and then hash it out.
Joe's input.
What was the question?
We were trying to go
I thought
yay or
about,
nay about.
So we have nay. Doreen said nay. I'm kind of yay because more people. It sounds like you're kind of yay because more people. Your opinion, Joe?
was to change it. I like the proposed language. I think it's fair for everybody. And I think if you don't change it, then are we going to actually go out there and enforce it?
That becomes that's a whole separate issue.
Right. But I mean, that's kind of what we're saying. No, we really mean this, but yet we're not enforcing it. That's a mixed message.
Yeah. And then it'll be right back in our laps.
Exactly.
So,
Well, I think the other thing, Michael, was, if I'm quoting you wrong, Michael, I apologize. He wants to ease up the process so that the city council can approve variances in the things.
yeah.
Create a method where they can do
Could
variances.
that even be done, Jim?
Pardon me?
The way it sounds, to paraphrase George, what Mike is looking at is, would there be a way of looking at our variance
Give the city
proposal so the city would have a little greater leeway to grant a variance? Or is that driven by state law?
No, there is no state law in Oregon at all about what the approval criteria are for a variance. If you're in some place like Vermont, or maybe it's Maine, they have a state law. So every city in that state has the same
Right.
approval criteria for a variance.
So it sounds like then what Mike is thinking of, could city council do something that loosens the reins so that variance process is a little easier by easier, I mean, a little less restrictive than the way, could they do that?
Well, they could, and because the variance process is generally written in terms of setbacks and building height, and how many parking spaces are required for like commercial things. Well, when you get to signs, most cities of any size have a special variance criteria list for signage because it's nothing like a regular building. Right, setbacks and building height and all that stuff. And so fences are kind of a weird thing. They're not really like a regular building. They're really not like somebody saying, well, I'm supposed to put in so many square feet of landscaping for my commercial, but I just don't have the space, or my property drops off and it's a steep drop down to a creek. And so I just don't have the space. I can't meet the landscaping requirement. So fences, I suppose we could have special approval criteria for a fence variance. But what that would do is generally allow more people to be able to justify not complying with the fence regulations. And if we're going to do that, and then force people to pay an application fee, write up justification, have a public hearing at the planning commission, why not just change the rules so they can do that anyway without going through a process and an application fee?
Because it starts taking up not just planning commissions, but it starts taking up city staff. It starts taking
Well,
up.
yeah, that's anything that's included in a planning commission hearing process takes up time, and generally, particularly in a small city, there aren't enough people to do all the work, and so the less process and bureaucracy they have to deal with, that leaves them more time to do.
And generally, are
really important.
then generally, at least with Lafayette, the sign permitting process, yes, Lafayette wants you to come and get a permit, but there's no cost for it.
Mhm.
So that keeps it as minimally onerous on the general populace as possible too.
Yeah, I frankly, I'm not aware of any city that has special standards, special approval criteria for a fence variance. And typically what they do is they just make sure their fence standards aren't onerous. And so people can, they say, I want to build a fence. Okay, here's what the rules are. And the people say, oh, yeah, okay, that makes sense. I can do what I want to do. And typically, fence regulations don't result in the city going bankrupt or result in other, big bad problems that none of us can think of right now. So then kind of like fences, why are we worrying so much about how high a fence is that's over next to a property line?
So then I guess I'll circle back. I made the motion to initiate the legislative process to amend the LZDO to allow a 6-foot fence subject to comply with clear vision requirements.
And just as a clarification, that was allow a 6-foot fence
And a side-
on the property except in the vision clearance area.
Well, 6-foot fence anywhere in the property except the front yard,
Okay,
except the front yard. We'll leave the front yard, we'll leave it except the front yard. So the other 3 sides. Okay,
so
that's a motion.
a good restatement of the motion. I'll leave you to ask for if there's a second.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay, we'll go by vote.
Well, you might want to ask if there's any discussion on the motion.
Any further discussion on the motion?
I'll get back to my one little pet peeve is identifying what is considered front yard. Where does it stop? Where does it end? And I'm not,
In the code right now, the front yard is the area from the front property line back into the private land, 15 feet.
okay, that applies to everybody but people on the corner lots, which is what my issue.
No, it applies to people on a corner lot.
Yeah, but if I don't have, but for fence purposes, I can't put a 6-foot fence within 15 yards of my front property line.
Well, is that due to some unique thing with your
Clear
property?
vision.
That's only in that one little corner of the clear, if it fits, and that's fine, that's what should happen.
I want to see the front yard for fence purposes only is clarified.
No, it already is clarified.
No, I want a clarification that I think it should, if I can't put a 6-foot fence up to the edge of my property on my corner lot, because it's 15 feet from the property line, that's a section of my house that I can't do. You're defining the front lot as the edge of the house. I understand that. And
If this distance for someone is less than 20 feet, then they'll have 6 foot. Little triangle out. That's better for most people than not. That would be better for most people than to say, oh, I gotta put the front yard here. You can't, that puts the front yard actually behind the house. And
Well, some people that have these power transformers or whatever, and they're generally on private property in an easement, pretty close to the sidewalk. And I forget what the distance is, but there's like a minimum distance of 3 feet or maybe 5 feet. And you can't obstruct anything there. So that people, if the transformer catches on fire, they can come in and take the top off and put it out and then have the power company come in and replace things. So it's not just the vision clearance triangle that for some people impedes their property. It's other things that can be there that would impede them.
Utilities have boundaries around their equipment because they have to
Well, I
access it.
understand that, but I'm trying to think of any transformers sitting on the ground.
Yeah.
Yeah,
there are,
well,
I can
that's
think
a
of a couple.
standard in modern subdivisions where the
Well, I
underground,
don't live in this. I live.
Yeah,
Right.
underground neighborhoods have.
right, so you wouldn't have to
My
worry
neighborhood's
about
awful.
the green
Yeah.
transformer metal box sitting on your property in an easement granted to the power company. But pretty much it's standard for all new modern subdivisions and for new commercial development
means fire
and
code too.
industrial development to have all the utilities underground.
Okay, so we have a motion, we have a second. Take a vote. Doreen, yay or nay?
Nay.
Joe, yay or nay?
Yay.
Mike, yay or nay?
Nay.
George, yay or nay?
I'll go yay for now, but I still want further discussion.
And I will vote yay. That's 3 votes yay, 2 votes nay. That will move the motion to start the legislative process. It'll kick it up to city, town council, and then they can wrangle with them there. They may kick it back, they may move forward with it.
The process that's been initiated then is an amendment to the development code. And so the step by step is there's a state law that says when a city or county in Oregon is going to amend its development code, you have to have the language and some kind of explanation as to what's going on and why, and send that into the Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development. And because they have those 19 statewide goals, And none of those goals have anything to say about fences.
No,
The Department of Land Conservation and Development won't care an iota that we're initiating a process to amend the development code. But we got to do it 35 days prior to the first hearing. So the first hearing would be a planning commission hearing. And that way, that would be the opportunity for the public to be made aware of this proposed change. They can come in and testify orally, or they can come in and submit written stuff in person, or they can attend via Zoom, or they can send in letters and emails anytime prior to the hearing, once they know that there's a hearing. And so the planning commission would hold a hearing. It would then pass a motion to recommend that the city council either approve whatever's proposed or deny it. And then the city council would hold a hearing. I might mention, along with a 35-day notice to DLCD, there's a 20-day notice prior to your planning commission hearing. And because it's a legislative thing where you're making law or changing existing law, legislative, not quasi-judicial, where you're applying existing law to a development proposal. For legislative, I think your code requires that there be a notice in the newspaper. Certainly a lot of people don't get a newspaper delivered anymore, but the news companies have legal notices on their website. And then nowadays, pretty much all the cities post these things on the city website. So,
and might show up in the water bill or something like that too.
well, no, not usually that.
That's not public enough.
Yeah, anyway, so there's a reasonable amount of notice, so the people in the community would be aware and can participate if they want to. And then prior to the city council hearing, there's possibly a second legal notice in the newspaper, but again, it would be on the city's website, except it wouldn't be at the planning commission. It would be a hearing at the city council. And then the city council would hold their hearing, take the planning commission's recommendation into account, and then decide what they want to do.
Okay.
And the city staff takes care of all that.
Well, the city staff would have to write a staff report for the planning commission hearing, would have to write the notice, would have to submit the stuff to the LCD.
Sorry, Jim.
In fact, do all of that background stuff.
Sorry, Jim.
Thank you.
Thank you in advance. So,
And at the city, or at the planning commission hearing, the proposed language is just proposed. It's not in concrete. So if what is proposed is not quite what you want it to be, then you can
tweak it.
change it and then recommend that council approve whatever the change is. Or if the commission says, no, we've had time to think about this. It sounded good back in February, but this is whenever, April. Nah, I'm voting no. So you don't have to vote the same way tonight or in the future as you did tonight. It's a legislative process. So it's pretty open.
Do we have any? We do have one piece of new business, which we'll get to, but do you have any pieces of new business coming from your end?
There are no applications in that would come to the planning commission for a hearing. There's one partition application in, a little infill thing. And partitions here are a decision by the city administrator. The decision would have to list all the approval criteria for a partition. The application would include information showing that all of those are met. And then the city administrator would sign a decision, presumably approving, and probably with some conditions. And all the owners around would be notified that the application is in, what the application is requesting, and they would have, I think it's a 14-day period within which to comment. So that would not come to the planning commission unless there's an appeal of the city administrator's decision. Other than that, I'm not aware of anything that's kind of floating around in the wings where somebody's been inquiring about something that would come to you folks for a public hearing and a decision.
Okay. As I said, I do have one piece of new business, and that is, we didn't take care of this at the very beginning of the meeting, but we have a new person with us. Joe,
No,
is that true, or is it just the fact that I haven't seen you in like months?
I just missed January. I was in November,
Oh, that's right. Okay.
October,
The
November.
rumor mill is that we will have a couple of new commissioners, or at least one. So, okay. I'm sorry for treating you like a new person, but well.
Hey, y'all look new to me.
No,
Yeah.
it started, my first one was October, I think.
Okay, well, that shows you how well my brain works. Any old business that we need to worry about? No, no old business. Okay, well then,
Just the, kind of before the meeting actually started, there was a little bit of discussion about the statement of economic interest, but that if, when you get it, then you deal directly with the Oregon Government Ethics Commission. And whenever I've called them on the phone, the person who answers the phone is a expert on the Oregon Government Ethics laws and has been able to get right down into the details and discuss and provide guidance and an answer. So because these SEIs are an annual thing, anybody that would answer the phone would be able to help you with whatever question you have about the form.
And his phone number is 503-378-5105.
need a pen? I mean, Jordan wants. That's okay.
I got the 503 card.
503-378-5105.
And that's the ethics committee.
Yeah,
Yes.
The Oregon Government Ethics
commission.
Commission.
And I'm gonna guess that you'll get an email from, either Dan, probably Danny at City Hall, some kind of notification that, hey,
Well,
is that-
Danny, when new people come onto the commission or come onto council, and
you'll be contacted.
the city staff lets the commission, the Oregon Government Ethics Commission
Didn't
know,
say that
and then they directly send you an email.
didn't Kevin say that they changed the law that I am now affected by it?
Yes,
Yes,
yes, you would be. And that was my bad for telling you there wasn't, because that was probably the way it was a couple of years ago. So my apologies.
Yeah,
Do
I got the email from the city administrator and from state of Oregon.
So do I have a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn?
Anybody second that one?
I second.
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Meeting adjourned. Thank you for joining us, Doreen.
Thanks, guys.
I'm sorry.
Don't worry about it.
I was just trying to understand
Good to
what.
see you.
Yeah, no
Why I
problem.
didn't see why I voted with the last time.
I'm not covered for accessory dwelling units. And that was another thing that popped up. Whatever that was, November or December.
Yeah,
or
there was
something.
some code we had to change. to
Yeah,
the
just
compliance.
Well, so we don't have to change it, though, to get that ethical thing, because we were looking at those things we did have.
No, so I updated all of our registry. They should be sending you an email.
And so it kind of sounded.
I do off your, well, here, if you, so then you'll set up
So is that
an
probably
account with them on their.
Yeah, that'd be excellent, and
And
actually,
then they'll communicate
in
with you.
the
through that,
January.
Yeah, I saw it,
Yeah, we never got to it because.
And if you got
Text thing.
any issues, give them a call. They're great to work
Well,
with.
no, this is not judicial, so we don't need to